A few months ago, I had a book of poems published, and there was a launch at the Beacon in Hastings, where a number of the poems were read out. And one of the poems was a poem I had done as part of a gay sequence, and it was called Coming Out. And in that sonnet, I explained how, for much of my life, I'd kept my gay side under wraps as if it were a separate life. And then when I fell in love, the screens I had erected between my gay life and my other self, as it were, fell apart. It wasn't, in fact, quite as simple as that in reality, because poems never do ever quite tell the reality. I came out when I was well into my 40s, and it was as late as that for several reasons. One was that I had been working in the city, which when I joined the first law firm that I worked for was a very homophobic place. And so there was no way that you would ever be an openly gay man. And the other was also that I was a practicing Catholic, which had a very strong influence. So both of those were restricting. And in the nature of things, your emotional side develops. And while I was still in the closet, I had a love affair for about 3 years with somebody who died at the end of those 3 years from AIDS. And I wouldn't wish on anybody the experience of that and being in the closet. It was a totally isolating, a traumatic experience. But when I then became involved some years later, because it took a few years to recover from that with somebody, I did come out. In fact, I was outed by one of my brothers, which I was a little upset about at the time. But in fact, it was the best thing that could possibly have happened. And what I realised on coming out was the extent to which I had been the main obstacle. None of my friends cared. Most of my friends realised that wasn't the problem. It was the fear that had dominated my life and my own acceptance of myself. And that was quite a lesson. And looking at the younger generation now, one has the impression that life is much easier and that they're more open. I have a young cousin who is in his late 20s, early 30s, who is openly out to his family in a very traditional social background, and there is absolutely no problem. But, coming back to the launch, what I was fascinated by after reading this poem about coming out was the fact that 2 women afterwards came up and bought the book on the strength of that poem, because each of them had a gay son. And in the case of one of them, the son had been so hesitant about coming out that he'd actually done it in a letter to his mother before Christmas, because he couldn't face having Christmas without this being made clear. And I was very struck by this, because it's one thing when you've come out, you realise that that's not the end of it. You keep coming out. And people, you don't necessarily emphasise it, but there are situations where an assumption can be made by somebody, which I usually try and correct, because it's important that people accept difference. And what that taught me, though, these 2 women in particular, was that coming out is still difficult for a lot of people, and how important it is, as a result, to show that there's actually nothing to be afraid of, that you've got to admit who you are to yourself. You may be different from everybody else, but so what? You can still be loved, you can still be accepted, but you've got to start by accepting yourself. And that was all reinforced by these 2 women who came and bought books at the launch.